There was a moment in the 6th century when the Roman world was about to collapse. The capital was burning. The streets of Constantinople were filled with smoke, corpses, and screaming mobs. The emperor was ready to run. His ministers were urging him to escape while he still could. And if he had fled that night, the Eastern Roman Empire might have shattered on the spot. No Justinian, no reconquest of the Mediterranean, no legal code that would shape Europe for centuries, no survival of imperial power in the East as the West continued to fracture. But in the middle of that chaos, one woman refused to panic. She was not a general. She was not born into royalty. She did not come from one of the old aristocratic families that believed power belonged to them by blood. She came from the margins of society, from a world the elite mocked, exploited, and pretended not to see. And yet when the empire's most powerful men lost their nerve, she was the one who stood firm. Her name was Theodora. To some, she was a scandal. To others, a saint. To her enemies, she was dangerous. To the poor, the trafficked, the voiceless, and those crushed by the arrogance of Byzantine power, she was something else entirely. Because Theodora didn't just help save a throne, she took on the corruption, cruelty, and hypocrisy of an empire built on privilege. She pushed for laws that protected women and girls. She intervened in politics at the highest level. And when the system around her turned rotten, she did what almost nobody in history dares to do. She fought it from the inside. This is the story of the woman who may have saved not just an emperor, but Europe itself. To understand why Theodora became so formidable, you have to understand where she started. She was born around 497 CE, in a world where birth determined almost everything. The Byzantine Empire called itself Roman, but by this time, it was a Christian imperial state centered on Constantinople, a city of staggering wealth, ceremony, and inequality. Power sat in palaces, churches, courts, and military offices. Society was rigid, class mattered, reputation mattered, and for women, especially poor women, the room to move was painfully narrow. Theodora was not born into comfort. Ancient sources place her father in the world of the hippodrome, the great racing arena of Constantinople, possibly as a bearkeeper connected to one of the racing factions. After his death, her family's security collapsed. Her mother struggled. Her daughters had little protection. In a city obsessed with spectacle, survival often meant being used by the entertainment world and by the men who controlled it. And this is what made Theodora so threatening later. Because she knew what elite men were really like when nobody was watching. She knew the hypocrisy of public morality and private vice. She knew how women could be discarded, bought, humiliated, and then blamed for the very system that exploited them. She knew what it meant to live in a society where the powerful wrote the laws and the weak paid the price. That experience mattered. When historians talk about corruption, they often picture bribery, crooked officials, and stolen money. But corruption is bigger than that. It is a culture where rules exist for the weak and exceptions exist for the powerful. It is a city where magistrates can be bought, women can be trafficked, and entire classes of people can be treated as disposable, while senators preach virtue from marble halls. Theodora did not study corruption from a distance. She lived beneath it. Somewhere along the way, Theodora met Justinian, and that meeting changed history. Justinian was not emperor yet, but he was rising fast. He was the nephew and political heir of Emperor Justin I. Brilliant, disciplined, ambitious, and obsessed with restoring Roman greatness. Justinian had the mind of a reformer and the drive of a conqueror. He wanted to rebuild the empire, reform the law, strengthen orthodoxy, and project Roman power across the Mediterranean. But Justinian saw something in Theodora that many of his class either missed or refused to admit. She was intelligent, exceptionally intelligent, not merely charming, not merely beautiful, not merely politically useful, dangerously perceptive. She understood people. She understood image. She understood pressure points. And above all, she understood the emotional and moral fractures inside Byzantine society. Justinian fell in love with her, and that alone was explosive. Because Theodora's background was considered disreputable, their marriage faced legal and social obstacles. Yet Justinian pushed through them and in 525 they married. 2 years later, in 527, Justinian became emperor and Theodora became empress. From that moment on, she was no ceremonial ornament. Contemporary and later sources describe her as Justinian's trusted advisor and one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. Think about what that meant. In one generation, a woman from the edge of the social order had entered the center of imperial power. She now sat at the heart of the state that had looked down on people like her. The same empire that had allowed exploitation to flourish now had, beside the throne, someone who had seen that ugliness firsthand, and she did not forget it. When Justinian and Theodora took power, the empire looked strong from a distance. But beneath the gold mosaics and grand processions, pressure was building. Justinian's government was ambitious and expensive. Wars cost money. Building projects cost money. Administrative reforms cost money. Taxes weighed heavily, and imperial officials gained a reputation for severity and unpopularity. In Constantinople, frustration simmered among ordinary people, political factions, and elites alike. The famous blues and greens, chariot racing factions in the hippodrome, were not just sports fans. They were social and political forces that could mobilize crowds and channel anger. This was the Byzantium Theodora entered as empress, a state with enormous ambition, a ruler determined to centralize authority, a capital packed with resentment, and an elite class that still had not fully accepted her. Imagine the palace politics, aristocrats looking at her and seeing not an empress but an intruder, officials pretending loyalty while despising her background, clerics maneuvering for influence, courtiers whispering that a woman like Theodora had no business shaping imperial policy, and yet she did. Because Theodora understood something many rulers never learn. If you want to survive in a corrupt system, you cannot just wear the crown. You have to understand where the knives are hidden. Then came the crisis that would define her forever. In January 532, Constantinople exploded. The Nika Riots began amid tensions involving the blues and greens, anger at imperial officials, and deeper public frustration with Justinian's rule. What started as unrest in the hippodrome became a full-scale uprising. The factions united in fury. Buildings were set on fire. The city descended into chaos. Even the great church, then standing on the site of Hagia Sophia, was destroyed in the violence. A rival emperor was proclaimed. Justinian's throne suddenly looked very real and very fragile. This was not just a riot, it was regime collapse in progress. The mob controlled much of the city. The palace was under immense pressure. Advisors around Justinian were losing confidence, and the emperor himself considered escape. You can picture the room, the best-dressed men in the empire, voices tight with fear, explaining why retreat was the rational choice, why survival mattered more than dignity, why it was better to flee and perhaps reclaim power later than die in a burning capital. And then Theodora spoke. We do not have perfect transcripts in the modern sense, but the tradition preserved about her response is one of the most famous moments in political history. She rejected flight. She argued that once one has held imperial power, exile is unbearable, and she is remembered for the line that royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. In other words, better to die as rulers than live as fugitives. That was the turning point, not because she gave a poetic speech, because she restored nerve where power had begun to rot. This is what corruption does in a crisis. It makes institutions look strong until the first true test. Then the masks fall off, the self-serving scramble, the courtiers calculate, the officials who looked invincible suddenly think only of themselves. Theodora did the opposite. She held the center, and Justinian listened. What followed was brutal. Imperial forces under Belisarius and others moved against the rioters, and the rebellion was crushed with terrible bloodshed inside the hippodrome. The human cost was enormous, but politically, the throne survived. Justinian remained emperor. The state did not disintegrate, and the empire entered the phase of Justinian's reign that history remembers for law, architecture, and imperial ambition. None of that looks the same if Theodora does not stiffen the regime at its moment of greatest danger. That is why some historians see this not merely as palace drama, but as a hinge point. Because if Justinian flees in 532, the Byzantine project is thrown into chaos, and if the Eastern Roman state fractures there, Europe's future changes with it. But Theodora's legacy was bigger than a single speech. The reason her story still matters is that once she had power, she used it. Not perfectly, not gently, not in a way that pleased everyone, but decisively. Britannica and other standard references credit Theodora with promoting social and religious policies important to her, and she is especially remembered for support of women's rights. Sources associated with her era and later tradition connect her influence with measures against the trafficking of girls and with protections for vulnerable women. She is also linked to institutions intended to shelter women who had been exploited, and this is where her personal history matters most. Theodora knew that empires like Byzantium often treated exploited women as both commodity and stain. Men profited, officials looked away, respectable society sneered, then the victims carried the shame. So Theodora pushed back. Imagine what that must have looked like from the perspective of the elite, a former outsider, now seated at the highest level of government, forcing a Christian empire to confront the ugliness it preferred to hide. Not foreign enemies, not barbarian invasions, its own moral rot. This was not just charity, it was political, because exploitation on that scale survives only when law, class, money, and indifference work together. To fight it, you have to challenge the habits of an entire ruling culture. And Theodora was willing to do exactly that. She pressed for laws and policies that gave women more protection in a world where they had very little leverage. She backed changes affecting marriage and sexual exploitation. She supported broader social intervention in areas where the state had long failed the vulnerable. Was that enough to purify Byzantium? Of course not. Corruption is never defeated in one reign. No law erases cruelty overnight. No empress, however powerful, can remake an empire by decree alone. But that is not the point. The point is that Theodora used power to disrupt a system that had every reason to stay comfortable. And that is rare. One of the biggest mistakes people make about Theodora is imagining her as simply the emperor's strong-willed wife. That is much too small. Multiple standard accounts describe her as Justinian's most trusted advisor and note that she exercised influence in policy, religion, and diplomacy. She is even remembered for taking on functions normally reserved for the emperor, including receiving envoys and corresponding with foreign rulers. That matters because it tells us she was not operating on the margins. She was governing, not alone, but actively. She shaped decisions. She had her own network. She understood the machinery of state, and the machinery understood that she mattered. This is another reason people attacked her so fiercely. A woman with influence is one thing. A woman who proves she deserves it is another. Because once she is competent, the old excuses stop working. Once she sees through the game, the men who relied on status alone become very nervous. And make no mistake, Byzantium had plenty of that game. Court intrigue, favors, factional scheming, religious maneuvering, patronage, whisper campaigns, power dressed up as piety. Theodora survived all of it, not because she was innocent of power politics, but because she was better at them than many who thought politics belonged to them by nature. There was another battle too, one often overlooked in popular retellings. Religion. The Byzantine Empire was not a modern secular state. Theology and politics were tightly intertwined. Disputes over doctrine were also struggles over legitimacy, authority, regional identity, and imperial control. Standard references note that Theodora favored and protected the Miaphysite community at a time when it faced persecution, while Justinian had to navigate the broader imperial commitment to orthodoxy. To some, this may sound abstract. It wasn't. In Byzantium, religious persecution was also political exclusion. To protect a threatened sect was to challenge the terms on which power was being enforced. It meant Theodora was not simply decorating the empire's official ideology. She was intervening in the real human consequences of religious policy. Again, this made her enemies. Again, it also reveals the same pattern. She had an instinct for those pushed to the edges, for those declared inconvenient, for those the dominant system wanted corrected, disciplined, or erased. This does not make her modern. It does not make her simple, and it certainly does not make her universally tolerant by 21st century standards. But it does make her politically unusual, because she did not always side with comfort. She often sided with vulnerability. After the Nika Riots, Justinian's reign continued, and some of the most famous achievements associated with his era followed. The rebuilding of Constantinople, including Hagia Sophia, the codification of Roman law, and the wider imperial campaigns that sought to recover Western territories. The legal work especially became one of the most important inheritances of Roman civilization, shaping later European legal traditions. Now think about the title of this story again. The Woman Who Saved Europe. Is that dramatic? Yes. Is it empty hype? No, because if Theodora's resolve during the Nika crisis helped keep Justinian on the throne, then she helped preserve the regime that produced one of the great legal and political legacies of European history. The Eastern Roman Empire remained a civilizational bridge, preserving Roman state traditions, transmitting law, influencing Christianity, diplomacy, art, and political order for centuries. Break that continuity in 532, and the map of European development becomes far harder to recognize. That does not mean Theodora single-handedly built Europe. History is never that simple. But it does mean that at a moment when one of the most important states in the world teetered on the edge, she was one of the decisive reasons it did not fall. And unlike many rulers remembered for victory, she was not only preserving imperial order, she was trying, in certain crucial ways, to make that order less cruel. If all of this sounds heroic, it is worth remembering that Theodora's image has always been contested. Some ancient and later writers admired her intelligence and power. Others, especially hostile sources, tried to reduce her to scandal, lust, manipulation, and moral corruption. That split in her reputation is itself revealing. Powerful women in history are often judged twice, once for what they did, and again for the audacity of doing it while female. And with Theodora, class sharpened the hatred. She did not merely become powerful, she crossed a line the aristocracy believed should never be crossed. She proved that birth was not destiny. She proved that political intelligence could come from outside the polished circles of privilege. She proved that someone the elite considered beneath them could end up ruling over them. That is unforgivable to certain kinds of societies, because corrupt systems do not only fear rebels, they fear examples. Theodora was an example that a woman from the bottom could understand power better than men born near the top. An example that exploitation does not always produce submission. Sometimes it produces memory, and memory, when joined to power, is revolutionary. Theodora remained empress until her death in 548. By then, she had spent more than 2 decades as one of the most influential figures in the Byzantine world. Her partnership with Justinian had helped shape the tone, priorities, and resilience of the regime. When she died, Justinian continued to rule, but her loss was profound. And yet her image never disappeared. She survives in chronicles, in argument, in political memory, in the famous mosaics of Ravenna, where she appears in imperial splendor, looking less like someone who borrowed power and more like someone who fully understood it. But the real Theodora is bigger than mosaic gold. She is the woman who knew what empire looked like from below and then forced empire to reckon with her from above. She is the woman who understood that corruption is not only theft from the treasury, it is theft from human dignity. It is the buying and selling of the vulnerable. It is the smugness of elites who call exploitation normal. It is the cowardice of rulers who freeze when history demands courage. And when that moment came in 532, Theodora did not freeze. So what is Theodora remembered for? She is remembered as one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. She is remembered for helping shape social and religious policy. She is remembered for pushing protections for women. She is remembered for opposing flight during the Nika Riots and helping save Justinian's regime. But maybe she should be remembered for something even sharper. She exposed the lie that corruption only belongs to greedy bureaucrats and crooked tax collectors. She showed that corruption can infect an entire culture, its morality, its laws, its treatment of women, its cowardice in crisis, its willingness to protect image over justice. And she fought all of it while sitting at the center of one of the most dangerous courts in the world. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but undeniably, Theodora did not command armies in the field. She did not write all the laws herself. She did not wear the crown alone. But when Europe's most important surviving Roman state trembled, she was the steel in the room. And maybe that is why her story still feels so modern. Because every age has its corruption. Every age has its respectable cruelty. Every age has its people who say this is just how the world works. And every now and then, someone rises from exactly the place the powerful least expect and refuses to accept that. That was Theodora, a woman the empire was supposed to dismiss, a woman history tried to scandalize, a woman who stood firm when emperors hesitated, a woman who turned survival into influence and influence into reform, the woman who saved a throne, the woman who challenged a rotten system, the woman who, in one of history's darkest turning points, may have helped save Europe. And the strangest part, she was never supposed to matter at all.